Today, an indictment was unsealed, charging Donald J. Trump with conspiring to defraud the United States, conspiring to disenfranchise voters, and conspiring and attempting to obstruct an official proceeding.
Today, almost 2 years after that fateful day in January 2021, that still Donald Trump and his allies and supporters are a clear and present danger to American democracy.
Hello, and welcome to Washington Post Live. I'm David Shipley, opinions editor at the Post, and I'm pleased to be joined by Judge Michael Luttig. As the clip we just saw made clear, someone who has been at the center of these monumental events. Judge Luttig, welcome.
Thank you, David. It's an honor for me to be here today with you and the Washington Post Live.
Well, let's start. What was your reaction to the indictment? Has it evolved over the last several days?
I'll answer that second question second. First, as to your first question, the indictment. David, the former president forced this indictment, this prosecution, and this trial on the nation for his own selfish, personal, and political ambitions. This indictment would have never come had Donald Trump not wanted it to come. On any given day since January 6, 2021, the former president could have avoided and prevented this indictment. As far as we can tell, he wanted to be prosecuted in order that he could run for the presidency in 2024, essentially on the platform that he had in fact won the 2020 election, and he would prove to the American people that he had that election had been stolen from him by re-winning the White House in 2024. Notwithstanding that the former president actually forced this prosecution, this prosecution and this trial, this historic trial of a President of the United States for the first time in American history for the grave offenses of attempting to overturn an election that he had lost fair and square, together with the attack on the United States Capitol on January 6th, in order to prevent and obstruct the joint session from counting the electoral votes to determine the presidency of the United States of America. This had to be, David, lest Donald Trump, in the end, be allowed to make a mockery out of America the Constitution of the United States, and the rule of law.
Did you
Your
think the? Oh,
Go ahead.
go ahead, Judge.
To your
I'm
second question, my important view as to the indictment has not changed in the several days since the indictment was returned. However, it concerns me gravely, though this was expected, that the former president and his allies have responded to the indictment in the way that they have. In particular, they have continued to attack and assail the institutions of American democracy and the institutions of our law and of the rule of law. In particular, and notably, most recently, by attacking not just the federal judiciary, David, but the particular federal judges who will be presiding over this historic trial. Now, as I said at the outset, this comes as no surprise to anyone. It's exactly what we should have expected, even if we didn't. Because if you think about it, this was the former president's modus operandi, literally from the first day that he assumed the presidency in 2016. You will remember, and your viewers will remember, that one of the first things he did was attack the federal judges that were deciding the cases for his policy initiatives from day one.
That leads me to ask, do you think that these 4 charges were the right charges to bring? I mean, as a reminder to viewers, the first count, conspiracy to defraud the United States, in this case, to obstruct lawful government functions. The second and third counts, conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding. And the fourth, conspiracy against rights, crime to block a privilege secured by the Constitution. Are there approaches that you would have found more durable?
No, David. So let's just take those seriatim. The charges that were actually brought were these specific charges that would hold the former president accountable for January 6th and for his effort to overturn the election and obstruct and impede the joint session and the counting of the electoral votes. That is not only the essence of the offenses committed by the former president. In my view, they are the whole of the offenses. The reason I say it that way is this. The only other charge that has been discussed, frankly, for 2 years, but certainly for the past year, has been insurrection against the United States of America, which is made a criminal offense under Title 18 USC 2383. Under that offense, David, the former president would not have had to have incited the insurrection on the U.S. Capitol. He merely would have had to aid or assist that insurrection. Nonetheless, that had Jack Smith charged the former president with that offense, insurrection against the United States, he would have been met with the president's defense under the First Amendment. As it was, Jack Smith scrupulously wrote the indictment around any possible First Amendment defense that the former president could have. In the language of the law, what that means is the former president now stands charged only with conduct that offends federal criminal statutes. Indeed, the indictment made crystal clear in its opening paragraphs that that the president was not being charged in any way whatsoever with respect to or with regard to his First Amendment rights to speak.
To assert that
In
he won the election.
that's right. And then the only other caveat that I would make is as to the deprivation of rights. That charge, that count, refers to the deprivation of the right to vote. There is no constitutional right to vote. What that statute, proscribes and criminalizes in this instance is the former president's efforts to ensure that the votes of the American people were not counted. This is not at all the common ground under that statute, which was a civil rights statute, as you know, originally intended to target those who would intimidate or harass African Americans in the United States from voting.
Do you think this trial can happen quickly, or will we have to wait until after the election?
I believe that it will happen before the election, and I believe that the American people have a compelling interest in having that trial held before the election, and I believe that the federal judiciary will do all within its power to ensure that the trial is held before the election. Incidentally, David, the speedy trial right, as it were, is a right that is lodged in the defendant, not the government. It's the defendant who always, David, except in this circumstance, wants a speedy trial of the charges against him.
Maybe we could talk for a second too about the sort of complete legal universe of Mr. Trump. Is there a virtue to bringing multiple cases in multiple jurisdictions?
It's to say nothing to say that this is unprecedented in all of history. Not only is this the first American prosecution of an American president in American history, but as your question presupposes, this president now will be subject to multiple criminal trials, state and federal. There's never been anything like this in history, and there never will be again. Frankly, David, this is singularly related to one man, Donald J. Trump.
Well,
I am confident that this particular trial will be held before the election. I believe that there will be an informal sequencing, if you will, of the multiple trials by the prosecutors, and that under that agreement, tacit agreement, if not explicit agreement, this case, which is the single case of greatest significance to the United States of America, will proceed first, and it will proceed before the election of 2024.
And since we're in the realm of the unprecedented, Neil Catchall, the former Solicitor General, in the Post earlier this week, made the argument that the United States versus Donald J. Trump should be televised. Do you have a view on that?
Neil Catchall is a giant in the law today. and I'm very proud to say that he's a dear friend. The moment I read that op-ed, David, I actually sent Neil a note that said something to the effect that this is an historic essay in the Washington Post. So, to your question, that this is a weighty question in the federal court system. But I do believe that in this one instance in all of American history, that this trial should be televised or otherwise accessible to the American people.
Can you talk for a moment or imagine a world in which Donald Trump is convicted and sentenced? As a jurist, how do you begin to contemplate that?
I've been contemplating it, deliberating on it, if you will, for 2 years now. Of course, never knowing to a certainty that the day would come, but as I said, believing that it must come, David. And so, yes, I've thought a great deal about it. This is a tragic day for America, and now this trial of this American president, together with the events of January 6th themselves, now become singularly infamous events in American history. The trial will be an embarrassing spectacle to the United States of America. Not only is it the first trial of an American president for grave offenses against the United States, but that man will be on trial during a presidential campaign in which he himself is again campaigning for the presidency of the United States. Never again will the world be inspired by American democracy in the way that it has been for since our founding almost 250 years ago, David. None of us could even begin to write the history that is about to occur over the next year, David.
I'm curious as you talk about that, Judge Luttig. Are we protected from similar acts in the future? I'm thinking about updates to the Electoral Count Reform Act. Do vulnerabilities remain, or do you think that we're in a more secure state?
Well, we're unmistakably in a more secure state, if not the most secure state, David, that we could ever be in. But because no system of governance, not even that of the United States of America, can protect itself unequivocally from a single person or persons who are determined to bring down American democracy. So, for instance, by way of explanation, I testified to the Congress that the Constitution of the United States neither contemplates nor accommodates the former president's effort to overturn the 2020 presidential election. And I went on to say to the Congress that had former Vice President Mike Pence acceded to the demands of the former president and overturn the election on January 6th, or for that matter, even delayed it, that would have cast the United States would have been plummeted into a paralyzing constitutional crisis for the first time in our history. And what I meant by the paralyzing constitutional crisis was that literally under the Constitution and the laws of the United States, no government official and no branch of our government would have known what to do or known what its authority was to do. And that includes the Supreme Court of the United States of America. That is a paralyzing constitutional crisis of untold dimension and magnitude.
Yeah. On that point, I was struck by something that Noah Feldman of Harvard wrote earlier this week, and I'm just going to read for a second so I don't get it wrong. He suggested that Congress should pass a law against election interference, and he said it could be written as simply as it shall knowingly be a crime to lie about election results with the intent to subvert the legitimate outcome of a federal election. Jack Smith's indictment, Noah argued, was that the government had to rely on statutes that were designed for other goals. Does this suggestion make any sense to you?
At large, yes, David. Specifically, Noah's viewpoint that Jack Smith had to rely on statutes that were not written to address this kind of circumstance. That's not uncommon, David. But what's uncommon is the circumstance. We never are able to anticipate all circumstances, and we are almost never able to anticipate these kind of extenuating, extraordinary, existential questions of constitutional law in drafting our statutes. So yes, he's right. On the other hand, not unlike the vast, expansive provisions of the United States Constitution, these statutes today that Jack Smith has charged the president with violating, they do accommodate these extraordinary circumstances. There will be no argument possible, for instance, on appeal from any conviction that that the president was wrongly charged under any of these particular statutes.
I want to shift just for a bit from the judicial to the political or to the human. I think it can be argued that you probably wrote the most consequential Twitter thread in American history. And by that, I mean in just a few tweets, you gave Vice President Pence an intellectual and a legal framework for explaining that President Trump's theory of throwing out votes was flat out wrong. Thinking of that moment, I couldn't help but think what it would have been like to be sitting in a room as the Federalist Papers were being written. And I was wondering if you could talk a moment or two about how you constructed those tweets, where you were, what was going through your mind, what you left on the floor, how in several precise expressions of vital constitutional thought, you sent this message out to the world?
Thank you very much for that question, David. First, I would say, as I've said repeatedly for 2 years, it was the highest honor of my life that the Vice President of the United States asked me to assist him
Yep.
in the discharge of his constitutional responsibilities on January 6th. These were not my responsibilities. And what I did is not an act of heroism in any sense at all, but it was an honor that he turned to me. As you know, I've had the great privilege, and that's the way I think of it, to have served in some of the highest roles and positions in the United States government in Washington, D.C. for 40 years now. In all of those positions, I have been thinking about the ultimate issues of constitutional governance in America. And in many, many instances, David, I've had the greatest privilege actually to address those issues myself personally in either writing or the spoken word. But the point is that for better or worse, and from my standpoint, it's better. I have been thinking about these kinds of issues my entire life, and maybe embarrassingly to say, little else but these kinds of issues. So no one could have ever expected January 5th, in my case, to arise. But I had been thinking about January 5th my entire life, professional life, David. So when that call came, the final call on the early morning of January 5th, I knew what I wanted to say, and I knew what needed to be said. So as you know, that it was a series of rapid fire calls from the Vice President's counsel and dear friend of mine, Richard Cullen, that culminated in the tweet. But before I went down to my
sitting at your desk? Were you sitting at your desk? Did you have the Constitution there or some other document? What were you? You know, it's always fascinating to find out how these things actually take form.
The first way I would answer that question, David, is that I knew that my moment for the country had arrived.
Mm-hmm.
I understood the momentous gravity of the moment. And I knew that I had an obligation to do it, and I had an obligation to do it perfectly for the country. And thankfully, I was ready for that moment. So as I was about to say, among the 3 or 4 rapid fire calls that maybe took 20 minutes total, I drafted verbatim what the world saw in the tweet on my iPhone, sitting in my breakfast room, having a cup of coffee, and then when the final call from Richard came, and he asked me, "Have you thought of anything that you can do?" And he had previously said, "We have to get your voice out across the country immediately." And I had told him I had no earthly idea how to do that. So in the final call of successive calls, he said, "Have you thought of anything yet?" And I said, "Well, I suppose I could tweet something, but I don't know how to tweet." And Richard said, "This is perfect. Tweet right this moment if you can." And I said, Richard, I don't know how to tweet, is what I just told you. And he said, we have no time left, Judge. You must tweet this now. So I hung up. I went downstairs to my office, and just on the way down, thinking, what on earth? How on earth can this is even possible? And the first thing I did was, the only thing I knew how to do was to transpose the iPhone text to a Word document on my laptop, because I knew how to work with Word documents, and I knew how to break that long text into threads of 140 or 160 or 180 characters. I had no idea what it was. And then I had asked my son, tell me right now how to tweet a thread, or I didn't know those words, of course, how to tweet a thread. And he said, Dad, open your email. I sent you the official Twitter thread instructions. And I hung up with my son, and tried to master those as quickly as possible. Read the tweet thread multiple times for not just errors, but fundamental errors of historical import. And then, as an act of faith, David, I pushed the tweet button, not knowing even what this was all about, and never even imagining that, frankly, anyone at all would ever see it. I had only opened my Twitter account a few weeks prior, and my first tweet was in response to a Adam Liptak article in the New York Times, and I ended up literally talking to 5 of the nation's Supreme Court reporters over the course of 5 hours to tweet that first tweet. And so I had no idea. And then I tweeted it, and about 10 minutes later, Richard Cullen called me and said something to the effect that, Judge, your tweet is on the front page of the New York Times. And I just said to him, David, I said, Richard, just leave me alone. This was so far beyond my comprehension. I knew at that point something was afoot. I didn't know what, and frankly, I didn't care. And that's the story of the tweet.
I mean, Twitter and monumental rarely go together, but this is again takes us once more into the realm of the unprecedented. But as the indictment made clear, Mike Pence was under tremendous pressure. But you must have felt it too, especially after you pressed that button. How has your life changed since hitting the button? I imagine friendships have been disrupted.
For me, that day was the greatest, in that moment, was the greatest intellectual and emotional experience in a life that's been very intellectual and emotional. I understood the profound gravity of the moment, but I also, to your question, I understood the gravity of the moment for the country first, and then second only for the Vice President of the United States. I could not, and I have not been able to think to this day of a greater pressure that could be put on a public official in America than the pressure that was put on Vice President Pence on January 6th. In that regard, I want to say this. Uh, I did not know Vice President Pence before January 6th. I had never met him and never spoken to him. Uh, and uh, I've never met him or spoken to him to this day, except once. The vice president called me in the morning of January 7th. I was down at the UPS store with my wife who needed to mail a package. And I said, I was just waiting at the door while she mailed the package. And I got a call that said spam in all caps, United States. I would never answer that typically, but I had nothing else to do. So I just answered it. And when I answer a call, like that, as all of us, I don't say anything because it's usually a recording and it's prompted by your voice. So I said nothing for seemingly a long time, and then a voice said, "Is this Judge Luttig?" And I said, "Yes, it is." And the voice said, "Please hold for the Vice President of the United States." And I froze with emotion. I scurried to the car and got in so I could have privacy. And as soon as I sat down in the driver's seat of the car, Vice President said, "Judge, this is Mike Pence. And I just want to thank you for what you did yesterday. And I will not say anything more about his side of the conversation."
Yep.
But I said, "Mr. Vice President, it was the greatest honor of my life that you asked me to do what I did yesterday. And I know that I can't understand the pressure that you were actually under, but I tried to understand the pressure when I tweeted what I did."
It
That's and then I'm sorry, I'm just long-winded. Your second part of your question was, how has it changed my life? Uh, it's it's dramatically changed my life, David. But it was it's not just changed it. Uh, Today, I say, euphemistically, that um, now for the rest of history, my life will be defined and known only as beginning on January 5th, 2021. But David, that's okay with me. Um, I It was such a high honor to me from the nation that if that's the only thing that's ever known about me, uh, I will be pleased and satisfied.
let me ask you one more question out of that, Judge, because it speaks to the pressure that you felt that Vice President Pence was under. You were on CNN this morning. I just want to read one thing quickly. There's no Republican Party to counter the Democratic Party in the country, and for that reason, American democracy is in grave peril. You said that this morning. These indictments have in certain ways increased Donald Trump's political strength, or at least they haven't lessened it. Can you just speak for a moment to me, say that if my view, as someone whose views have not changed, we're sitting together in our backyards across a fence, my thoughts about the president haven't changed given all that has transpired. How can you persuade me to change my mind if I haven't changed it already? And it feels strange to even ask this question, but how do you make the case for the rule of law?
Well, I've thought about this too, David, at great length, and was very recently asked by someone publicly to answer it. And this was my answer. Um, in America, we we have a Constitution, and we Americans live in accordance and by that Constitution. And that Constitution provides for the resolution of all our disputes, small and large. But it especially, and most importantly, provides for the resolution of the greatest disputes that can occur in the United States of America. In particular, those disputes, depending on the nature of them, are resolved by the executive, the Congress, or the executive and Congress, or the Supreme Court of the United States. In the situation where the dispute is to be ultimately resolved by the Supreme Court of the United States and or the federal judiciary as a whole, then those decisions are the final decision in America on that dispute. And when the courts or the Supreme Court finally decide those momentous questions of constitutional law in America, we Americans accept those decisions. It doesn't mean at all that we have to agree. And many, many times we don't. And incidentally, David, any Supreme Court justice should say and be willing to say, we may get it wrong sometimes. We're not angels. We just do the best we can. And that's their decision. My point is this. What's going on with those who will not accept the election and those people who either did or favor or approve of the attack on the United States Capitol is under our Constitution an act of revolution. And the intellectuals that are behind, conservative intellectuals that are behind all of this, that's exactly the way they articulate it. Here's the problem. They go back to the Declaration of Independence and they point to the passages in the Declaration of Independence that say, there will come a time when the abuse of power is so great as to be intolerable. Of course, that's correct. And we Americans came to that point almost 250 years ago. And we had a revolution against the king. And we created a new nation and a new constitution to govern that nation. It is not possible, and it's not right now to be talking about a revolution against the American government. But that's what the intellectuals behind this radically conservative movement are saying and would want.
Well, thank you, Judge Luttig. That was a wonderful conversation, and I think it could happily keep going for another day or two. So I hope we can have you back. But in the meantime, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Washington Post.
And thank you to everyone who was joining us here today. To check out what interviews we have coming up, please head to WashingtonPostLive.com to register and find more information about all of our upcoming programming. I'm David Shipley of Washington Post Opinions. Thanks again.